Hello everybody, you're listening to the Polymath radio show with your host, Daniel Aaron Levy. And I'm especially excited for this episode because for the first time on this show, I'm running a special. And this special is going to be about various ideologies such as capitalism, socialism, communism, anarchism, fascism, and some other stuff in between. And we're going to be looking at these ideologies in a political science perspective. We're going to be taking these terms, which everyone has kind of heard of, but we're going to be properly analyzing them using political science. We're going to be saying what they want, what do they stand for, what are their general kind of policies, and we're going to be doing so in a non-biased, non-partisan way. And this episode is what actually is a political ideology and where do they all come from. And it serves as this kind of launch pad, this starting point to all of the subsequent episodes in this special that are going to comprise it. I don't know how many episodes it's going to be. I've got like a bullet point note script for this whole special. I shouldn't say it's annoying. I've got this bullet point note script for this whole special, and it's about 14 A4 pages, so we do have a lot to say, so it's probably going to be a few episodes, but I think all these episodes you can watch individually and you can understand and enjoy all of them. I think it's best enjoyed all together though, because I want to take you on a journey. I want to take you on this tour through all these ideologies together, and each episode is designed to be best kind of appreciated following each other because it all leads into each other. Now this episode I actually just recorded, but I'm re-recording it because I don't think it was that good. And on Polymath, I want to give you guys quality. I want to give you guys the good shit. So I'm re-recording it to try and do it just a little bit better. So this episode, we're going to be using political science to break down a political ideology. We're going to be thinking to ourselves, what is this? What actually is an ideology? How can we conceptualize it? How do we split it up? And then we're going to be going a bit deeper. We're going to be using political philosophy. We're going to be looking at the ethical judgments and values held by different ideologies and the kind of fundamental moral positions that link to different political stances. And doing so is going to bring us to the mother of all modern ideologies, liberalism. And of course, we'll be thoroughly talking about liberalism and what that is. And then from that starting point of liberalism, we're going to be getting into all of these other episodes. So, just for people who are new to the show, this is a conversational, unscripted, off-the-cuff show. I want it to feel like I'm having a kind of conversation with you. I want it to feel casual, but it's still going to be informative. And the key thing is it's entertaining and informative, but we also want it to be non-biased, non-partisan. I just want to use political science and history and economics to tell you guys what the stuff actually is. So, enough foreplay. Let's get into it. So what actually is a political ideology? So we often conceptualize different ideologies in terms of being left-wing or right-wing. So fascism, people tend to conceptualize as a far-right ideology. Socialism as a left-wing or far-left. Communism is further left. Anarchism is further left than that. Clearly the idea of the left-right political spectrum is key to understanding ideologies. But we then need to analyze what that spectrum is. What do left-wing and right-wing actually mean? Now, as a lovely segue / plug, my previous episode 8, depending on whether I upload this, it may not be the immediately previous episode, but a previous episode 8, is on what the left-wing and right-wing actually mean. And I really recommend looking at it before this, but you don't need to. You don't need to do that if you don't want to. All of these episodes are designed so you can enjoy them individually without any context in other Polymath episodes, but it would be best. Just as a brief summary. So the left-right political spectrum, it's this big one-dimensional spectrum, and people kind of broadly associate leftism with the ideals of freedom and equality and progress and progressive policies. And for example, let me just think of some more examples. Here we go. The economic policies of social welfare and economic intervention, redistribution, the idea of political rights, of green policies, of progress, of reform, of trans rights, of veganism, social welfare, which I already said, internationalism, etc., etc. And people tend to associate rightism with the ideas of order and authority and stability, tradition, duty, and also a rejection of the new progressive ideas which has come from the left. But generally some fundamental acceptance of basic democratic principles, although depending on how far right you go, this isn't necessarily the case. Now, all these associations are correct in their own way, because we can untangle these many threads of leftism and rightism and split that one-dimensional axis up into three separate spectra. The first spectrum, or axis, is the libertarian/authoritarian spectrum. And it's basically a spectrum about political power and how it's used. So how much power should the government have over the daily lives of its citizens, and how should power be distributed in society? The second spectrum that we can diffract leftism and rightism to is economic. So economic leftism versus economic rightism. Economic leftism and economic rightism refer to how much the government intervenes in the economy. Far right is not at all. Far left is central planning, where the government dictates what's made, where it's made, and what happens to what gets made. It's important to note that economic leftism and economic rightism is just one constituent of the left-right political spectrum as a whole. The name is the same because life's not perfect, I'm afraid, ladies and gentlemen, but there are different concepts. And the third spectrum refers to socio-cultural values. It is a socio-cultural spectrum of progressive versus conservative. And there's lots of other ways to split up and rethink the left-right spectrum into different constituents, but this is a basic and I think appropriate method. And just some examples for that first spectrum of libertarian versus authoritarian: fascism is hyper-authoritarian, anarchism is hyper-libertarian. Policies like national surveillance programs or general government intervention in the daily life of its civilians is more authoritarian, whereas the absence of that is more libertarian. In terms of economic leftism and economic rightism, far economic right is minarchism, where for example, where the government provides only a military, a police force, and law courts, and that's all the government does. Further left than that, but still an economically right-wing policy, is laissez-faire capitalism, where the government doesn't intervene in the economy, and you get various degrees of intervention in the economy within the framework of capitalism as we move further towards economic left. Socialism is further economic left, communism is further than that, anarchism is furthest economic left of all. And finally, the idea of progressive versus conservative, the idea of social cultural policies, its stances on social issues such as racism, homophobia, transgenderism, feminism, veganism, for example, etc., etc., etc. So we've established that we can diffract this left-right political spectrum into three different axes. Now, different ideologies can be characterized as encompassing different ranges on each of this axis. So something like fascism, for example, it's going to be hyper-authoritarian. It's going to be hyper-conservative. In terms of its economic policies, it will occupy a range of economic policies within that spectrum of economic left to economic right. But the boundaries, the upper and lower boundaries of those ranges are still going to be present. So fascism you're not going to have a socialist system. Fascism is still generally, as practiced, a capitalistic ideology. At the same time, in fascism, there is government intervention in the economy, and often the government acts as an actor in the economy itself. So that economic system is known as state capitalism. State capitalism is when there is capitalism, but when the government intervenes in the economy and regulates it, and also acts in that economy. So it actively intervenes, for example, in supporting certain businesses. It also does things like potentially own its own operations and run these for profit. Fascism tends to be within that kind of realm. I'm using fascism as an example. I just want to say that we can map an ideology onto these three axes, and on each of these axes, it will accompany a range of different positions, however narrow or wide that range is. Now, just as we've diffracted that left-right spectrum to three axes, we can conceptualize an ideology as having three basic components. Number one is about political power. What is the nature of that power, and how should that power be used and distributed? Number two is about the economy. How should the economy run? And number three is about ideas in general. And that's not just about socio-cultural policies and stances. It's about deeper ethical and moral principles. It's really when we get into political philosophy. Because different ideologies have different values, not just at what policies are good, but what goodness actually is, what we should be aiming for in a civilization, and how should we reach that goal. And that also involves the attendant social and political psychology that comes with that. And when I say social political psychology, I mean the ideas that exist in people's heads regarding politics. So for example, democracy. Democracy is now a common element of Western social political psychology. Indeed, a common element of global social political psychology. But for the vast majority of human history, that hasn't been the case. Democracy just hasn't really been thought of. It just hasn't been proposed as a serious political idea, and indeed it didn't really exist in the minds of most people. In fact, pretty much no one conceptualized democracy, or had any conception of democracy in the idea that we now conceive it, for the vast majority of human history. Perhaps the only period in history where the idea of democracy did exist in popular consciousness, or even the consciousness of just educated individuals, was in ancient Greece. So, looking at history, there were broadly, two types of categories for civilizations, based on what is their judgment of the good life. What makes a good civilization? One of these types of judgment can be characterized as the ideology of liberalism. And liberalism, you're probably thinking right now, potentially, of the liberal versus conservative divide in the USA and how liberals may be liberalists. Just ignore that for now. Erase your conceptions of what liberalism is, because liberalism actually is a much broader and very different animal than what the definition of liberal is in modern Western parlance. So liberalism is indeed currently the dominant Western ideology. And in liberalism, the ethical judgment made on civilization is that the goal civilization should strive for is an association of free and equal individuals. Whereas so freedom and equality are inherently good things, and people aren't conceptualized as just belonging to a particular class, even though in practice they often may be, but rather the basic political unit of a liberalist civilization is the individual. Not an aristocracy, not a peasantry, not a merchantry, but the individual. Now, the French Revolution was a revolution in 1789 and was the first ever revolution enacted on liberalist principles. And the motto of the French Revolution was Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité. I hope my French accent isn't too terrible. I hope you can understand what I'm saying. And that translates to liberty or freedom, equality, and brotherhood. And in liberalism, these are inherently good things. And this may sound completely obvious to you guys, but for the vast majority of history, that has not been the case. Liberalism is a historical aberration. It has occupied perhaps 5 centuries of human history since civilization began in 4000 BC. So, liberalism not only holds these inherent goods, but it also holds other things as inherently good. It holds reason as inherently good. In liberalism, society should be based on human reason, on what we think is a good idea, on the exercise of the human powers of rationality. And the rationality and reason and science are seen as good things. Liberalism also holds that truth is an inherently good thing. Knowing the truth is a good thing, and people should know the truth. Not just a narrow caste of elites in a society, but society as a whole should value truth. And finally, and the most important thing with liberalism, is that violence may be acceptable as a means to an end, but it is a necessary evil. Violence is not a good thing. The goal of liberalist civilization is indeed that of civility, of the restraint of violence, of the use of decency and argument, and avoiding actual brutality and savagery and barbarity. This, again, is very rare in human history, which you might find shocking, but that's only because liberalism is the current dominant ideology. So here's the thing. In liberalism, freedom, equality, truth, justice. I didn't mention justice because non-liberal societies do also value justice generally, even though the value of justice is subordinated to the exercise of power, but we'll get onto that in a bit. Justice, humanity, and reason are inherent ends. They're not means to an end. They are good things. They are the aims that civilization is reaching for. Now, this emerged firstly in classical Greece in the 5th and 4th centuries BC, and then as this brief blip in human history. Snap my fingers for effect now. I just got a little bit caught up in it. But this brief blip in human history, and then again in Europe in the 1700s, and a social and political phenomenon called the Enlightenment, where a bunch of people, a bunch of thinkers in Europe started to adopt and develop liberalist ideas. So liberalism represents a tiny minority in history. So a non-liberalist political and moral philosophy has dominated the vast majority of history and epitomized the vast majority of societies. And in these, the ethical judgments that civilization makes are not based on the attainment of freedom and equality. Freedom and equality and reason and truth and humanity are not seen as inherently good things. They're just simply not conceived as moral or desirable goals. The desirable strive for society is a hierarchical one, based on the division between those who exercise power and those who are subject to it. And the moral and political ideal of these societies is that the masses should be disciplined and obedient and nothing else, just disciplined and obedient, so that they can act as the most effective tool as possible for the exercise of power by the elites in the society. And the exercise of power, the use of force, are seen as good things in themselves. They are not means to an end, they are the end. And indeed, violence, rather than being seen as a necessary evil, is seen not only as entirely legitimate, but is often also seen as an inherently good thing. There is no ethical premium placed on humanity. Violence, not necessarily violence within a society, because most societies have acknowledged a need for law and order, but violence, for example, between societies, and violence often in practice as a daily part of life, for example, towards women and the treatment of women in these societies, is seen as moral and normal. The limitation of power and violence in the name of humanity, freedom, and equality is simply not recognized, nor do these societies want it to be recognized. They are explicitly rejecting the morality of those conclusions. So, this, as we can imagine, leads to quite significant moral abuses, because when you create a society based on the inherent principle that some people are better than others, we often get those who are seen as better treating those who are seen as lesser really quite poorly. An example of this, a great example of this I can give, is in ancient Rome. Now, you may have heard of the character Cicero, who is often idolized in the Western imagination as this libertarian figure of democratic and / republican ideals against the tyranny of Caesar. In fact, there is a city in the USA named after him. Now, Cicero used to work as a lawyer, and one of his clients, Publius Gnaeus, who's on trial for bribery and corruption, the prosecution mentioned that he had violently raped, in fact, a 12-year-old girl who was an actress. Cicero got around this by not denying it, but by just saying, so what? And he was appealing to the dominant moral and political ideals at the time, which was that this woman, this girl, was an actress which in Roman society occupied a very low social rank, just above that of a slave, for example, and that therefore it was custom. He used the word custom to describe what Publius Gnaeus did. And Publius Gnaeus faced no further flack for doing this because it was a normalized action in society at the time. So no one in the court even tried to prosecute him for doing that. It was seen as completely normal. Indeed, for most of Roman history, until I believe the Emperor Septimus Severus extended citizenship to all Roman inhabitants, the rank of citizen in ancient Rome was not just a marker of saying, oh, you live in a city. It was a specific legal rank of privilege held by about 10% of inhabitants of the Roman state. Now, under Roman law was only applicable to Roman citizens. So, for example, prevention against being raped, which was known in Roman law at the time as stuprum, only extended to Roman citizens, i.e. that 10% of the populace, whereas non-Roman citizens would be governed under the laws of their native societies, which in practice obviously would have still made rape illegal. But the key thing is that if a Roman citizen, i.e. a member of the Roman elite, raped a non-Roman citizen, the law would basically just look the other way. And this kind of hierarchical abuse we see occurring in multiple different non-liberal societies at pretty much all eras of history. So, for example, in feudal Japan, a person of high ranking, such as a samurai or a daimyo, was allowed to beat, abuse, degrade, humiliate, maim, and I think even kill a peasant basically at will. That was prescribed in the law because they were just seen as better. Indeed, in feudal Europe, serfs were legally unfree. They could not, it was illegal for them to refuse to work on their land that their lord had given them, or to refuse to give services to their master. And all justice for European serfs came from their lord. So the lord was their provided legal and judicial arbitration between serfs. So if a lord, say, raped or mutilated or killed or maimed or severely humiliated or traumatized or abused a serf, in order to deal with that justice, the serf would have to appeal to that lord. And there were systems of appeal, but, for example, in medieval France, a serf could appeal to the parlements, which were these kind of province-wide judicial entities, but the parlements were filled with lords themselves, who obviously would not want to legislate against their own class, because then it provides a moral precedent of how they could behave. So in practice, it was pretty much impossible to get any form of justice. Also, human sacrifice was extremely common in various societies. For example, in ancient China, from about 2300 BC to 300 BC, when an emperor died, classically, a bunch of the people working for him would just be buried alive with him, so as to provide him with servants in the afterlife. By the way, this is not like unique to ancient China. Multiple empires throughout history have done this. And of course, with non-liberal philosophies, we classically see slavery. And obviously slavery, people know is bad, but just take a moment to think of the moral suffering endured by that. Millions of people who could be beat, raped, abused, mutilated, humiliated, killed, or maimed at will for so many points in history because they were legally not given rights. For example, in ancient Rome, slaves would be displayed for auction naked to display bodily defects, but also to explicitly remind them that they were no longer in control of their own bodies. Another example is a group of Vikings in the 9th and 10th centuries called the Varangians, who lived in Western Russia, but at the time a region called the Kievan Rus, had a ritual where every time a chief died, a slave girl would be drugged, raped repeatedly, around a dozen times by different chieftains, and then starved to death, so as to provide the dead chief with a wife in Valhalla. Also, with the non-liberist philosophy and its lack of condemnation of violence, violence just became endemic to these societies. Another example I'm going to give is in ancient Rome, where rape was frowned on when done for example, towards a Roman citizen, and indeed severely punished. But for another example, in war, if a Roman soldier raped a foreigner, or indeed just raped a foreign, and by the way, I don't just mean soldiers, I mean civilians, because the Romans didn't really draw a distinction between them. Or if a province in the Roman Empire was rebelling and soldiers raped any civilians of the rebel nation, that was not seen as a bad thing. In fact, it was seen as an encouragement. It was encouraged as a sign, as a demonstration of the soldiers' virility and strength, and as a kind of payback for the foreign people or the rebellious people for daring to defy Roman authority. And it was seen as a reassertion of Roman authority. By the way, fun fact, Caesar slaughtered so many civilians in Gaul, i.e. modern day France in his campaign, that it's been termed as genocide. And I'm telling you all this because I really want to emphasize the fact that the ramifications of these ideologies are real. This isn't just abstract stuff. This determines the daily lives and daily sufferings of millions of people. So the distinction between liberalism and non-liberalism is very, very important. And at its basic, most fundamental level, we can indeed categorize all ideologies based on whether they are or are not liberalist. Now, indeed, the modern ideologies that are relevant in Western society, stuff like capitalism, liberal democracy, socialism, communism, fascism, anarchism, everything in between, these all spring from the root of liberalism in some way, either in accepting or rejecting liberalism. So liberal democratic capitalism, as seen in the long 19th century, which is a historical period dating from 1789 to 1940, that's the French Revolution to the start of World War I. Liberal democratic capitalism, which emerged in this period. Of course, liberal democratic capitalism has had many variants, but what I mean by the long 19th century is this period of liberal democratic capitalism based on classical liberalism, which I'm going to explain in a bit. Don't worry. So classical liberalist capitalism, socialism, communism, anarchism, they all spring from liberalism. They all accept its idea of the ideal society. They all accept that freedom and equality are good things, and that reason, truth, and humanity are good things. They just disagree wildly on the means to reach that ideal goal, and indeed what composes that ideal goal. Now, fascism is the opposite, because it explicitly rejects liberalism. Fascists like Goebbels said that they wanted to wipe out all European moral progress since the Enlightenment, i.e. since the 1700s when liberalism began to emerge. Pre-liberalist societies also reject the goal of liberalism, and indeed, like fascism, share the ideals of a hierarchical society based on the exercise of power and obedience. However, pre-liberalist traditionalism and fascism aren't quite the same, and we're going to be exploring the distinctions between them on a later episode between them. Now, modern Western society used to be, after the French Revolution and until around the onset of World War I, when liberalism had decisively established itself in the West, modern Western society used to be divided on the basis of liberalism versus non-liberalism, where the left broadly was a liberalist position and the right broadly was a non-liberalist position. Nowadays in the West, basically everyone accepts the ideas of liberalism. They just interpret it very differently. It is only the extreme right who would consciously reject the idea that freedom and equality are good things, and who would consciously advocate a hierarchical society based on the use of power, violence, and obedience. In practice, the line can often get blurred because many more extreme writers do indeed advocate for the use of violence and the use of terror as a means of supporting their own policies. But the key is, what is the end goal here? Are we aiming for a free association of equal individuals, no matter how bastardized that conception may be, or are we aiming for a hierarchical society? So let's take a look at what liberalism actually is, and let's explore how this common ideological route to give rise to these massive divergences like classical liberalist capitalism and communism. So, remember when I said that we can look at an ideology in three different parts, in three different aspects, let's say. One is political power, the use and nature of it. Two is economics. And three is the ideas common to it. And we've been exploring the ideas of liberalism for quite a while now. But let's look at liberalism's views on political power and its exercise. So, i.e., what policies and what ways of organizing society does liberalism support as ways of reaching that ideal of freedom and equality? Now, liberalism encompasses quite a large range of different schools of thought, but what's generally held in common by all of them, the fundamental bedrock of liberalist policies, are as follows. First is rule of law, i.e., there is a law in society that everyone, even the most powerful person in the nation, is subject to, and that the most powerful people in the nation can't just do whatever they want. They have to obey the law. Everyone has to obey the law. Now, again, for the vast majority of history, this was not the case. An example I can give, a really famous example actually, is in Louis XIV, this French king, who famously said, "Les états c'est moi," the state is me, i.e., I am the law. I do not obey the law, I am the law. I do whatever I want. And that general kind of idea, a classic line of non-liberalist societies. Liberalism also classically, although not in all basically liberalist philosophies, for example, communism, liberalism classically supports private property, i.e. the fact that you as an individual can own things, and the government can't just take that away from you at a moment's notice for no reason at all. The government cannot violate your right for private property, i.e. to own things, purely at its whim. You have to have done something if that's going to happen. It also means that the role of the government is to protect your private property against those who may want to take it, whether they be fellow economic competitors or employees, for example. Another classic tenet of liberalism is consent of the governed, which is kind of self-explanatory, and in fact, throughout Western history in the long 19th century, the net of the governed whose consent was considered to matter under liberalism has changed at various intervals. So, for example, in Britain, say, in 1832, after the passage of the Great Reform Act, the political classes decided that actually the consent of the upper middle classes mattered, but it had not yet decided that the consent of the lower middle and the working classes mattered. Another key aspect of liberalism is the idea of political equality. that there is no legal privilege. No one is born better than someone else. There is no hereditary privilege. There is often economic privilege. And in fact, Western liberalist nations before the aftermath of World War I often barred people from holding the vote. But that was based on the property that they owned, not the people that they were born to. Liberalism also supports the idea of rights, that in a society, an individual has the right to not be killed, to not be attacked, to not be beaten, to not be brutalized, to not be tortured. The idea of rights, again, is not something which has been a universal in human history at all. It is part of this great historical rarity of liberalism. And liberalism also supports civil liberties. The idea of being freedom of speech, freedom of association, i.e. the ability to form organizations like trade unions, the freedom of religion, freedom to criticize the government. Liberalism also classically supports the policy of secularism, which is that whilst individuals may practice religion, they need to do so privately. And the tenets of religion, no matter what that religion is, should not be involved in the governance of a state. That is secularism. It is the separation, as is classically known in the West, of church and state. Now, theoretically, you could have a liberalist ideology in a nation which is ruled by one autocrat who voluntarily chooses to pursue a liberalist ideal with these policies. In practice, the system of power that has always emerged as a means of securing liberalism is democracy. Now, democracy is a word coming from the Greek word demos, which means people, and kratos, which means power. Democracy is a political power system, which basically means that rather than power being held by a single individual or an aristocracy, or a military in the case of stratocracy, or the wealthiest in the case of plutocracy, or a few individuals in the case of oligarchy, power is held by the people. Now, in practice, the conception of the people is often quite restrictive. So, for example, in ancient Athens, they call themselves democratic, but in fact, only around maybe 25% of people can actually vote. So, what I'm trying to say is that democracy is not necessarily necessary for liberalism. In practice, democracy is an integral part of what liberalism is, and has, in so far in history, proved the only means of securing liberalism. No other means will do. Dictatorships or monarchies in the sense where the monarch has power, classically establishes societies which are not liberalist, even if, in the case of 20th century socialist countries, they claim to be based on liberalism. They were clearly not. Now, in the libertarian/authoritarian political axis that I spoke of earlier, liberalism inhabits quite a wide range of these, depending on the policies of the government, but is necessarily cannot be too authoritarian, because the whole point of liberalism is consent of the governed and accompanies democracy. And democracy classically is going to be libertarian to some extent, because it means that you're not just ruled by one person or a clique of people. And indeed, liberalism tends to be fundamentally libertarian in the sense that the purpose of laws in a liberalist country are to tell people what not to do. It defines the boundaries of acceptable conduct, but within those boundaries, the individual can act as they want. Whereas in non-liberalist societies, this hasn't been the case. And laws are also about prescribing individuals about telling them what they can do, or at least proposing so many limits and so many restrictions and regulations on what they're able to do, that in practice, they don't really have much room for individual maneuver at all. Now, let's talk about economics. The economic system that has again occurred naturally as a kind of means of securing the liberalist ideals and liberalist policies, the natural economic system that has evolved for liberalism is that of the market economy. Now, a market economy is basically an economy when what determines the decisions on what gets made and who gets what gets made is determined by economic laws such as supply and demand, and where these decisions are made with varying degrees of regulation, mostly by individuals or by companies. Now, a market economy is not the same as capitalism. Capitalism, by definition, is a market economy, but within the market economy framework, you can also have variations of socialism. Now, don't worry, we're going to be talking about capitalism and socialism in later episodes. We don't need to delve too deeply into this for now. The point is that a market economy framework has a really, really wide range. And as you can imagine, within this range, there are lots of different competing interpretations of liberalism and different schools of thought on how that liberalist ideal, an association of free and equal individuals, can be attained. So this can kind of give us an idea of how a common root like individualism can give such diverse daughter ideologies in the form of, for example, classical liberalist capitalism and communism. Let's start with what classical liberalism actually is. Classical liberalism is all the political policies I've just mentioned, including and emphasizing private property and the inviolability of private property, and also prescribes that the government should not intervene in the economy unless it is in some way designed to uphold the rights of private property. So, for example, in 1871, part of France, Paris, went partially socialist in a political entity called the Paris Commune. And classical liberalism was ideologically okay with the French government suppressing the Paris Commune by force and by slaughtering all the communists, which is, by the way, what they did. So, classical liberalism, however, apart from in these extreme situations where force is required, generally maintains that government should not interfere with people and should not interfere with the economy. And it arose in response to a fundamentally unfree world, because classical liberalism emerged in its modern form in around the 1700s in Europe in a backdrop of both massive political and economic unfreedom. Political unfreedom in the form of a lack of political equality. People were not equal. They did not have an equal right to happiness. And hereditary privilege was very much a thing. Some people were legally superior to others because they had been born into a legally superior class. And politically, people were not conceived as individuals, but as members of that class. And economically, there was also quite a lot of lack of freedom. So many people, or many commoners, were serfs, so they were legally unfree. They were bound to work the land that they lived on, and they were bound legally to provide labor services for their lord. Also, there was massive government intervention in the economy in the 1700s in European countries, and indeed across the world. But this intervention was not to support industry in the economy. It was specifically to enrich the government in the short term. It was also often explicitly to restrict and limit competition and to restrict and limit economic innovation. I'm going to use France as an example because a lot of the institutions that allowed Britain to industrialize were completely ousted in France. In France, you had in the 1700s quite rigid system of guilds, where within each city, a certain trade, for example, shoemakers, silk weavers, everyone legally practicing that trade had to belong to this guild, which was this organization which was rigidly hierarchical and basically prevented any competition in that trade, in that area. It also explicitly discouraged innovation. We also have a situation where many workers in France were legally bound to their masters and could not stop working for their masters unless given permission. In this sense, they were almost kind of like industrial serfs, although that is a term of my own coinage. I haven't really seen that being used. The point is, and by the way, that industrial serfdom, as I've just called it, emerged after legislation passed in 1749 in France. And I'm using France as a microcosm here to just establish the principle that the government didn't intervene in the economy. The nation was not free in the sense of politics or economics. And classical liberalism sought to establish political freedom in the form of basic legal equality and political equality and everyone having political rights. And also no government intervention in the economy, the inviolability of private property. So classical liberalism, obviously all the classical liberals at the time, they were progressive for their time, but these people did not support working class rights or trade unions or social security or welfare. They were all members of the middle class who were pursuing an economic and political philosophy which ultimately was most beneficial to the mercantile and business middle classes. The idea was that they would be allowed to conduct their business and grow wealthy, and that they would no longer have to face political barriers of hereditary privilege which limited them from gaining high levels of social status and prestige and occupying positions of political power and controlling the machinery of the state. Now, throughout the course of the long 19th century, so from 1789 to 1914, the states in the West gradually conformed to the political and economic ideology of classical liberalism. If in unequal steps and in unequal progress based on a specific nation. Now, the result of this was that by 1914, in Britain, for example, people did have political rights. There was a respect to civil liberties. Not all people could vote, but their ability to vote wasn't determined by who their father was, but rather what their level of wealth was. However, with this political equality came huge amounts of economic inequality, and the lack of government intervention in the economy led to quite a lot of human suffering in economic terms, especially in the first 3/4 of the century, where economic legislation protecting workers was much lower. Contemporaries in the early 1800s in Britain, for example, paint a very grim picture of what the life of the individual worker was like. And it was generally one of near constant work, maybe 14 hours a day, in terrible conditions, living in deeply unsanitary, cramped conditions, in a position where they were basically living check to check on the verge of starvation, just living above subsistence. It was a very grim lifestyle, and it was one where harsh discipline was maintained in factories. People could lose limbs without being compensated. What was quite common in America, actually, in the USA, was for people to work, for example, companies which didn't pay them with wages, but which paid them with tokens, which they could only spend in specific company stores. So, and by the way, this occurred deep into the 1800s in the USA. People would be paid in tokens. They would then have to purchase basic goods like food and clothing at massive prices. And there was nothing they weren't even given money. Like, they couldn't go anywhere else because they weren't even given wages. Now, during the long 19th century, various different ideologies arose in response to this marked economic inequality and the consequent human suffering. Socialism is a classic one. More on this later. But another ideology is social liberalism. And social liberalism is a variant on liberalism. It's not classical liberalism, but it still fundamentally supports capitalism and private property. And socialism developed during the long 19th century, and it became dominant in Western country after the Great Depression. So social liberalism also emphasizes political equality, rule of law, no hereditary privilege, etc., etc., etc. But it also emphasizes social justice and social services, and the government intervening in the economy to provide these. So the government regulating the economy, providing protection for workers in order to address social issues like poverty, social welfare, healthcare, unemployment, education, and infrastructure. Social liberalism also accepts the idea of a mixed economy, which is when some industries in the nation are not controlled privately, but are indeed run by the government. For example, railways. Railways were classically nationalized in many countries in the 20th century. The idea behind social liberalism is that political equality isn't actually enough to achieve the liberalist ideal of freedom and equality, an association of free and equal individuals. It doesn't go so far as, for example, communism, so as to say that private property and private ownership of the means of production need to be abolished altogether to achieve this ideal. But it accepts the fact that some level of intervention is needed to secure that ideal. Social liberalism basically says that in an economy with zero regulation, a billionaire and a wage slave having the same level of political rights is actually meaningless in practice because it clearly doesn't lead to freedom and equality. Social liberalism as an ideology has a few other names. It's also known as a social market economy, social capitalism. It's also known as Rhine capitalism. And that's because after the 1970s, social liberalism, unlike in Anglo-Saxon countries, like i.e. the USA and the UK, after the 1970s, social liberalism became the dominant ideology in various countries in Europe which bordered the Rhine. So Germany, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Social democracy is a system of political power based on the ideology of social liberalism. Initially in the 1800s, when social democracy was first forming, it was seen as a means to establish socialism. So the establishment of socialism was a long-term goal. After social liberalism became the dominant ideology and social democracy became the political power system to uphold social liberalism, it rapidly lost this socialist intention. In fact, social liberalism became dominant after the Great Depression because the ruling classes of Western countries were like, wow, if we don't do anything to intervene in the economy, people are getting angry. and people are starting to want to establish socialism. And if they establish socialism, there's going to be revolutions. There's going to be loss of private property. We want to maintain capitalism and to maintain private property. But to do that, we're going to have to make some concessions in the economic sphere in order to avoid revolution. And it, in fact, worked. And the West has not had a socialist or communist revolution. Social democracy was dominant in the West, particularly in the era after World War II to the early 70s. And this era is known as the golden age of capitalism. I'm not going to be talking about this too much in detail this episode, although we will be talking about the Great Depression and the golden age of capitalism later. But basically, this golden age of capitalism was due in part to the policy of social liberalism and the partial intervention of government in the economy, and in part due to prevailing global conditions. We're going to be talking a bit more about different varieties of capitalism and the golden age of capitalism and its policy causes in an episode on capitalism later. So the 1970s saw another shift in the dominant interpretation of liberalism. And 1970s saw the emergence of neoliberalism, and this is the ideology supported by Thatcher and Reagan. And it is in effect a return to the political and economic orthodoxy of classical liberalism. I'm not going to go into too much detail about why this emerged. It basically occurred because during the 1970s, various global changes happened. The policies enacted by global leaders to address these changes didn't work, and there was this massive rethinking in what was seen as a good way to run an economy, and hence the emergence of neoliberalism. And neoliberal policies, again, it's a return to classical liberal orthodoxy, so it really emphasizes lack of government intervention in the economy. Reagan classically said that big government was the problem and that government should be small and non-interventionary. In practice, neoliberal policies include privatization of key industries, for example, privatization of the railways in the UK, deregulation of the economy, tax cuts, opposition to trade unions, reductions in social spending, etc., etc. There are often minimal government service provided. So both the UK and the USA under neoliberalism do have some social security provision. So it's not a complete return to classical liberalism, but it's very much in that same ideological strand. And whereas in social liberalism, the primary aim of economic policy was to deal with unemployment, in neoliberalism, in neoliberalism, the primary aim of macroeconomic policy is to deal with inflation. And that's really because, again, social liberalism became dominant after the Great Depression, when people could clearly see the dangerous effects that mass unemployment had, and neoliberalism emerged in the 70s during an era of stagflation, so unemployment plus inflation, where people could clearly see the deleterious effects of inflation. It is worth mentioning as an aside that scientific research has shown that unemployment has about a 4 times greater change in the unhappiness of an individual than inflation does, and unemployment can actually be a really radically disruptive and a really negative, misery-inducing element in an individual's life. But I'm not going to be talking about that much here. I just want to make that kind of statement that there is an intersection between scientific research and politics, and it's a very important intersection to be aware of. So, the different interpretations of liberalism are all based on that idea of freedom and equality, but they conceptualize different means, different policies of the best ways to get there. And they also give different emphases. So social liberalism tends to emphasize equality. Classical and neoliberalism tend to emphasize freedom, as in that idea of economic freedom. The idea that the government intervening in the economy reduces the freedom of the people in a nation in an unacceptable way. Now, the modern American definition of liberal. So we have this, I say American, but I mean in the West in general, we're living in an era of quite large political polarization. And in fact, there are understandable causes for that, which I'm going to be talking about in another episode. But just for this one, we have the idea of the left versus the right in modern Western parlance. And in America, this is often described with the terms liberal versus conservative. Now, the modern American definition of liberal is that of social liberalism. Now, socialism is not technically bound up with progressive policies. Social liberalism is more of like an economic, when I say progressive policies, I mean progressive social cultural policies. Social liberalism is an economic and political prescription. It doesn't really say anything about racism or feminism or trans rights. But both historically and in the modern cultural divide, social liberalism is associated with progressive social cultural ideas. Now, on the other side of the political divide, conservatism tends to be more about conservative socio-cultural policies, but it's also associated with economically right-wing policies and the philosophy of neoliberalism. Now, but a key thing to understand is that apart from extremists, in the modern Western cultural divide, both left-wing and right-wing are still liberalists. They still see freedom and equality as good things. There have been some divergences in liberalism from the right recently, mainly in the idea that, as Michael Gove said, the nation has gotten tired of experts, which is not really a national prescription, but is potentially an accurate description of some sections of the right. We tend to see in the right nowadays, especially under Trump and other various right-wing populists such as Modi, Bolsonaro, etc., a return to irrationalism and a rejection of scientific experts and a rejection of the use of reason. However, there are some significant other sections of the right wing, particularly those following Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro, which do still explicitly claim reason and facts and scientific research as inherently good things, as values that we should be basing modern politics on. The point I'm really trying to make it is that sections of the right wing nowadays are starting to drift a bit away from liberalism in their practical policies, but generally in their ideals are still liberalists. Now, it is worth elaborating on the idea of modern rightists in the West starting to deviate from liberalism in their policies. Current affairs isn't something I'm used to talking about here, so forgive me if I'm just a bit more hesitant. I think especially with America and in Trump-era America, the Trumpite right are starting to see a practical divergence away from liberalism, particularly, for example, in the January 6th insurrection, where we saw the attempted use of violence to impose a non-elected political figure in power in lieu of a democratically elected figure. We also see a rejection of liberalism in the trial of Daniel Perry, which is something that would enter the news fairly recently, but I do think is genuinely worth mentioning. And Daniel Perry so in around 2020, there were Black Lives Matter protests occurring near Daniel Perry's house. Daniel Perry was a self-described racist and white supremacist. He also said that he might go and kill some protesters. I'm actually going to just I'm going to Google search Daniel Perry case here, just so I can give you guys some more accurate information. So this man so he wrote in messages on social media, "I might have to kill a few people on my way to work. They're rioting outside my apartment complex." And he said he might go to Dallas to shoot looters. He also gave advice for people who wanted to kill protesters, aiming to shoot the center of mass because it's a bigger target, and telling people that they should use self-defense as a legal defense in order to avoid prosecution. So Daniel Perry one day drove into a crowd. He didn't run anyone over, but he drove into the Black Lives Matter protester crowd. A man called Garrett Foster, who was a military veteran who was carrying a gun, walked up to him. Daniel Perry then shot him dead. I think multiple times, actually. I'm not sure. Don't quote that. So he claimed that Foster had pointed his weapon at him, but eyewitnesses basically said that wasn't true. He didn't aim his weapon at Daniel Perry. Also, the rifle wasn't loaded. So Daniel Perry killed him. He was then convicted by a jury of murder. And then, very recently, on the urging of the American right, Texas Governor Greg Abbott then legally pardoned him and then said that he would be allowed to his firearm rights would be restored. Just to give an example, just to give some more background on Daniel Perry, he referred to the Black Lives Matter movement as monkeys and animals at the zoo various times. He also said in a text, "Too bad we can't get paid for hunting Muslims in Europe." And he was also grooming 16-year-olds on Kick. Now, this man was the subject of a not insignificant campaign by American conservatives in order to have Greg Abbott pardon Daniel Perry against the conviction of a jury, which is indeed what happened. amid a fair degree of controversy. This is blatantly anti-liberalist in that we're seeing the use of political power in the form of Greg Abbott to contravene rule of law. Another interesting deviation from liberalism we're seeing across the American right is this return to the merging of church and state, i.e. for religious prescriptions to be used in state policy. So one of Trump's cabinet members, Betsy DeVos, was a creationist who advocated that creationists should be taught in schools, for example. You also see this kind of church and state thinking in the massive American rightist impetus against abortion, and it was indeed a major factor in the overturning of Roe versus Wade. We also classically see in Trump's rhetoric a lambasting is such a weird word, but it is what's going on, of science and scientific experts, which we classically saw in his handling of the COVID-19 crisis and his dealing with Anthony Fauci. There is in fact a Sacha Baron Cohen to the show called This Is America, where he basically got a right-wing crowd to sing about gassing scientists and slaughtering them, which, as we can see, is not very liberalist, because one of the main tenets of liberalism is indeed the use of reason and science and progress. But the thing which should be mentioned is that many Trumpites probably see all of these measures as means of achieving that liberalist ideal of freedom and equality. And in fact, right-wing rhetoric in America is really, really heavily based around freedom. Not so much equality, but freedom is still very much on these people's minds. Even if for example, the January 6th riot, many Trumpites did that because they in fact thought that the election of Joe Biden was an example of democratic subversion, and by the use of violence and force, they were indeed restoring rule of law. What I'm trying to say is that even though it is a guarantee that sections of the American right, especially neo-fascists, will explicitly reject liberalism and will want a hierarchical ordered society. And there is also pretty much a guarantee that perhaps more moderate but still quite far-right sections of Western society do want a liberalist ideal as it applied to male white citizens, but do not want a liberalist ideal applied to women or minorities, for example. However, it is also very, very likely that the vast majority of people in the West who would identify as right-wing still do appreciate the values of freedom and equality and still do aim for an association of free and equal individuals, but they just do so want to achieve that ideal by very different means, and they conceptualize that ideal in very different ways to the modern Western left. So it's likely that many right-wing leaders, for example, potentially Donald Trump, don't subscribe to a liberalist ideal, but the vast majority of their followers do. This is in contrast to fascism or in pre-liberal societies, which I'm going to call traditionalism in this spectrum. If you look up traditionalism, you get directed to the Wikipedia page for traditionalist conservatism, which is a form of conservatism developed at around the time of the French Revolution, basically explicitly rejecting the values of the French Revolution. Traditionalist conservatism is best identified with the figure of Edmund Burke, who famously opposed the French Revolution. But traditionalist conservatism isn't necessarily, Edmund Burke, for example, still did see the restraint of violence as a good thing in general, and still generally supported some idea, some measure of humanity, justice, truth, and reason. The point I'm trying to make is that traditionalist conservatism is still influenced by liberalism in the fact that many of its proponents weren't influenced by liberalism, but many of its proponents, especially those in Britain, were influenced by the movement of liberalism into the 1700s. So when I say traditionalism in the context of this special, I just mean the form of societal organization which predates the emergence and acceptance of liberalism. So a fascist or traditionalist would explicitly not revile necessarily, but explicitly reject the idea that freedom and equality should be the goals of the state, and indeed classify the goals of civilization as discipline and obedience on behalf of the masses and the effective use of power on the behalf of the elites. So, that is a summary of what actually is a political ideology and where do all the modern ones come from. And the key ideology that we've looked for that we've examined as the mother of all these various ideologies that we're going to be looking at in subsequent episodes is liberalism. And the idea of a liberalist versus non-liberalist society, I think, is a very important fundamental conception, not just to understand capitalism, communism, etc., but also as a piece of information in its own right. I do think that's really, really important. And in the next episode of the special, we're going to be looking at ideologies specifically. And again, I recommend watching the episodes of the special in the order of their upload because they all kind of feed into each other. Really, this is I think the fundamental episode that I think would be best before watching other episodes of the special. For example, I'm going to upload What is Capitalism before What is Socialism. And I think in that What is Socialism episode, it would be useful to have watched the capitalism episode beforehand, but I think this is the most important one. But again, all of these episodes on the special, indeed every episode of Polymath, is designed to be watched and enjoyed and appreciated independently. This concludes our episode today. I really hope you guys enjoyed. I'm really, really glad I re-recorded this. I think it's made a massive difference. And also, I really want to commit to providing the highest quality for you guys. If you're listening to this point, I am sincerely honored. If you've listened at all to any of my episodes, I'm sincerely honored. Obviously people who watch this episode partially and haven't reached this point will never get to hear this, but I just want to say, anyone watching any part of this episode or any episode, it's really an honor. It really flatters me. I really, really hope you guys enjoy and find this interesting. And I hope you guys have a lovely day. Take care.